We wanted to start off with a sort of an informal conversation with Nigel Wilson. I'll read you his formal short biography. Nigel Wilson is Professor Emeritus of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. His research and teaching focuses on urban public transport, including topics related to the operation, analysis, planning, and management of transit systems. Professor Wilson directed major long-term collaborative research programs with urban public transport agencies, including Transport for London, MTR, Hong Kong, Chicago Transit Authority, and the MBTA in Boston. He has written more than 100 articles and reports on the results of his research. During sabbatical leaves from MIT, Professor Wilson worked in 3 large transit agencies, the MBTA, London Transport, Metro Transit Minnesota, Minneapolis area, and has served as a consultant to a number of other North American transit authorities. He has been a visiting faculty member at Stanford, University of College London, Napier University, TU Delft, and the University of Minnesota. Professor Wilson received a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Imperial College London and earned both his master's and doctoral degrees in civil engineering and transportation systems from the MIT, from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So that's a formal introduction, but on a personal note, I've known Nigel for a very long time. I did my PhD at MIT in the 1980s, and Nigel was on my doctoral committee and was incredibly helpful. I've always been passionate about transit. I knew it, that's what I was going to do. And so it was very useful getting to know Nigel and his interest in transit. And he was very instrumental because my PhD was a little bit controversial at the time. But since then, we've become very close friends over time because I think our paths have sort of merged in a certain sense, where he came from a very academic background, I came from more of applied, and we sort of now agree that we need this bridge between academics and practitioners. And he's also had a very big influence on the world of transit. Many of his students from the MIT Transit Lab are now in the industry, in transit agencies and consultant firms. I was shocked to find how many of them were on my TRB Transit Planning Committee at the time, and I'm sure I know there are many that are online right now. So we thought it'd be a good chance to have a little bit of a chat because he's been following the whole evolution of the use of data for transit planning and operations from the beginning. And so with that, I thought we just have this conversation. So Nigel, to start off with, could you maybe just say a few words about your personal arc of professional development and that led to where you are now?
Yes, first of all, thank you, Brendon and Alma, very much for organizing this as a virtual conference. Congratulations on getting to the starting gate, and I think we're off to a very good start. And also thank you personally for inviting me. I welcome the opportunity of talking with everyone about my experiences and what I see as the future opportunities and challenges. So in terms of background, over 50 years ago, when I first arrived at MIT, I got involved in an interdepartmental course to develop the urban transportation system of the future. And out of that came the ideas of dial-a-ride and demand-responsive transit, also bus-only streets, sort of the core of bus rapid transit, and PRT, automated guideway systems. I personally have always been interested in fairly short-run implementable ideas. And I thought that demand-responsive transit was at that end of the spectrum compared with some of the more high technology things. And here we are, lo and behold, it took about 50 years for these things to be implemented. But
it's finally happened.
it did finally happen. So in terms of the evolution of my interests, it started with, can we find something that's more responsive than fixed route transit and less expensive than taxis, which provided non-shared ride door-to-door service? Is there something in the middle there that can really serve an important niche in urban transportation? This was partially inspired by the seminal book that was published in 1965 called The Urban Transportation Problem by Mayer, King, and Wohl, all associated with Harvard at the time. And that really focused a lot on what the issues were with the current urban transport system and how it might evolve in the future. And that was sort of inspirational for a lot of the work that we were doing at that time. So having focused on demand responsive transportation, dial-a-ride, and the early implementations of those systems in Rochester and Haddonfield, New Jersey, and other places like that, I became somewhat frustrated that it wasn't getting implemented as widely as I thought it might. And I decided really to shift my focus to working with public transport agencies and trying to take advantage of the expertise in the agencies, but have a planning focus on the short run to try and make the systems more responsive without moving away completely from the fixed route, fixed schedule idea. So that's really my career evolution to focus on public transport. Now, of course, we're back where TNC is a very significant part of urban transport, certainly well before COVID-19. And I think the interesting challenge now is developing these integrated urban transport systems that use the best elements of conventional transit, the best elements of demand responsive, as Amma said in his introductions, the best elements of technology in terms of automation, electrification, all of these things. So I think it's a tremendously exciting time to be working in this. And I think the program that you and Amma have put together is a great opportunity for saying, where are we now? What are the next steps towards that goal?
It's interesting, the arc, because I think you were way ahead of the time with the DRT in Rochester and so forth. That's sort of where I started my career in Westport and Bridgeport Transit District. But you know, you were trying to do this with TI-99 calculators and no data or punch cards. So it may have been a little premature to try to really develop algorithms that could do real-time assignments. And they're also, as I think we've discussed many times, it's not just the algorithms and the technology, the operations, the business models, the governance models, we're still facing that in spades with all the efforts to try to bring in TNCs and microtransit with transit. Yeah. They're different cultures, they have different objectives. It's not that easy, but we're making a lot of progress. Right. But that's, okay, but then going back to the beginning, why public transport? Just serendipity, or was there something specific that attracted you?
Yes, as you know, I grew up in the UK. I use public transport every day. And so I was, from the very beginning, sort of intrigued by the potential of public transport, and yet somewhat frustrated that it didn't seem to be as responsive as it might be to the needs of the passengers, the riding public. And so short of shifting completely to a demand responsive type of organization, how could you make this system more responsive than it seemed to have been? We've all heard stories of public transport bus networks which don't seem to have changed in their elements for decades or half centuries. And why is that? And that's what got me focused on the short-range public transport planning activities. And as automated data became more available, as Amma mentioned, through APCs and AFCs and AVL systems, it seemed there was a lot of potential there for making better use of this data, as you say, along with organizational innovation, institutional reform, to transform the industry from the inside. And I think that's why personally I became interested in public transport and how it sort of linked with my sort of external view of taxis versus public transport, and say, well, maybe working with the transit industry more closely, we can get some significant advances.
Yeah, another similarity, because I grew up as an adolescent in France, and exactly for that, that's what got me passionate about transit. And then when I came back to the US at the time for university, the difference in quality of systems was shocking, and I just knew it. I've seen that it could be better, and there was much that could be done. But I do, the whole focus of data, I want to point out something interesting. All academics want data. but they want data to do the research. And primarily to publish in journals that nobody else has access to except for other academics.
Yes.
I've always been admiring you because the data that you wanted was actually to be used to develop applications that would improve the efficiency or effectiveness of transit systems, which is a different mindset of why you want the data.
Right. Again, I've always been interested in seeing how the work that the group that I've been associated with can influence practice. And so I've always been fairly pragmatic and practically oriented, a bit of an outlier in terms of many research university academic careers. And so that's always been sort of personal motivation for me. And I think in terms of seeing what happened, the early activities in application of automated data collection systems, for instance, at OC Transpo in 40 years ago, when they had APCs, they had AVL systems, and were really beginning to use them productively within OC Transpo to improve the system and monitor the system. To me, that was really inspirational, and I would point to the early experiences of OC Transpo as really formative for me in terms of this is an area where you really can get things done and implemented. So that was very exciting.
Yes, the OC at the time, I was part of the team with Peter Firth on TCRP 113, which is one of the seminal works in this area. And I wrote the write-ups, which are still on the web doc for TCRP for OC. STM Montreal and Portland TriMet were all leaders at the time. And likewise, it was amazing what you could see, but frustrating to see how far ahead some systems were versus the bulk of the industry that just wasn't there yet. And we'll come back to that. And we'll also maybe come back, the whole issue of the challenge for an academic to do applied research is a whole nother topic we'll explore in Plenary 8.
Right.
Okay, so you've worked with the Transit Lab, you developed this model, and I know tomorrow in the Spotlight, Jinhua is going to be talking about the process that MIT and Northeastern are pursuing with this working collaborative approach. But in doing this, in pursuing this collaboration with some of the leaders in the world, like Transport for London and MTR in Hong Kong, what are some of the organizational technical features that make them stand out? Why are they leaders in using data? Why have they been leaders in using data?
Yeah. Well, let me talk specifically about Transport for London, because I think in many ways TfL is a model for what leading agencies can do if they really focus on this. So again, linking this to my own history, I was on sabbatical leave, as you said, working with a number of agencies. And in 92, 93, I spent the year in London working with London Transport, the predecessor organization to Transport for London. And the application I worked on most strongly, or had a focus on, was called Countdown, which is the early implementation of bus arrival information at bus stops prior to the existence of smartphones, where you can get it conveniently wherever you are. But you get to the bus stop and you have the sign saying next bus on this route will be in 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever. So even before TfL was created, there was a strong interest within London Transport about innovating and seeing how technology can be used. And then when Transport for London was created, which was shortly after 2000 in the sort of restructuring of government in London, this was a new organization. It could continue sort of best practices under London Transport, which had existed for more than a century in its predecessor and later form, take advantage of that, but bring in new leadership that were passionate about public transport, as you said, but were fairly powerful in terms of the overview, the breadth of reach that they had as an organization, TfL, and could come in with new ideas. And I think the other thing that was was quite important there was the overall environment in the UK in transport and other sectors where there was a lot of innovation going on. And in the 90s, you know, when I was there at London Transport, there was a lot of discussion about how public transport and transport overall should be restructured in London, and that led to the formation of TfL. So I think in the case of TfL, it's sort of a classic model where it had had a great history through its predecessor organizations, but it was a new organization. It had new leadership, it could bring in new ideas. And one of the new ideas, which they've implemented, in my view, very, very effectively, is saying, how can we make use of intelligence, data, knowledge in a non-traditional way? And I think they've really pioneered and blazed that trail very effectively. So as you also said, we work with MTR. MTR is a very different organization in Hong Kong than Transport for London. It's principally a heavy rail operator, a first-rate heavy rail operator, though. And so it has a focus on technical operations and technology and engineering, as opposed to the broader overview and oversight responsibility that Transport for London has. But again, both of these organizations have had a tradition of attracting very high quality individuals. So you have very high quality staff, and they're both relatively new organizations with a willingness to innovate and try different things. So they combine the experience of years of operation in predecessor organizations with sort of a fresh mindset coming into the industry and a love of public transport, passion for public transport. And I think that's really, these are key ingredients for success.
It's interesting, those two in particular, because they also were leaders in developing smart card technology. Right. And beyond just, I mean, MTR already had stored value mag cards before it went to smart cards, so the transition wasn't that difficult. But then they used it because of the culture and things you just mentioned. Transport for London, I remember going in the 90s, they had already, it takes a long time to put in place a smart card system. They had started in 93 already, and it took 10 years to get it operating. But then, you know, and they had trouble at the beginning. But both of them understand that the systems, whether the ITS, the AVL systems or the APC systems or the smart card systems, they're, in most agencies, they're chosen for, you know, an AVL is chosen for its operations control and security function, and smart cards for just revenue control. But both of them realized that the data itself was a whole world of analytics that they could exploit. And the same thing I saw in Canada with the transit systems that developed APCs early on, and some in the US like TriMet and so forth. It wasn't just, you know, in the US, a lot of it's just for filling in NTD reporting, as opposed to using it to actually provide understanding of the ridership and the operations, and use it as a tool for, like a business would, in terms of developing its marketing strategy and its delivery of service.
Right.
But yeah. It's good. Go ahead. If you...
Well, I think the point you're making is a very important one, that these individual technologies were developed not for data collection and data use as the main objective. They all had, in the case of APCs, just sort of monitoring the level of usage of the vehicle, AFCs, revenue protection, and AVLs, safety and security in the case of an incident on the route. And so for all of those companies that developed those early technologies, the use of the data was not a primary goal. And I think the transition that's occurred over the last 20 years is that more and more companies and more agencies recognize that data is tremendously valuable in terms of improving the overall quality of the service and making it more efficient and more effective. And so I think that's a major transition that's occurred that leaves us in a much better place now than we were in the early days of these technology development efforts.
I agree. It's been frustrating to see how long it's taken to get here. I go to lots of conferences at APTA, CUDA, TRB, and it's taken a very long time with a very small number of leaders, but we're finally, as this whole conference is showing, a much broader range of places that are really thinking about using data. However, in collaborations that you've had with transit agencies, I know I've heard many times you sort of say, well, you know, it worked because the CEO, you know, made it happen. And they were interested. They allowed you to sign the deal that would get you a small percentage of capital budget to have this interaction with your students and do applied research that was of mutual benefit.
Right.
Which is, I totally agree. But the challenge that remains is that, especially in the States, and more in Canada, unfortunately, the CEOs get swapped out after every 2-3 years. They either get burned out or thrown out. And when they go, it often, the data culture disappears. And is there, you know, is there anything that, building blocks that we could think about that to try to, you know, anchor a culture of data-driven decision-making?
Yeah, well, I clearly the points you're making are really important challenges that if you want to develop long-term collaborations between research community and the public transport operating community, these are real challenges. As Jinwa will talk about more tomorrow, I think the model that we've followed relied very heavily at the beginning of any developing new relationships with top-level management. And I think that's the sort of entree into the organization. To protect against leadership changes, you have to develop very strong support throughout different levels of management and analytical staff in the organization, and hope that as the leadership transition inevitably occurs, that they will see enough benefits from the relationship that they will argue strongly this is an important relationship to continue, even though this is obviously not the main reason these agencies are in existence. And that doesn't always work, but I think that's the model for trying to sustain long-term relationships. Again, we've been fortunate in having long-term relationships with all of the agencies that you mentioned, anywhere from 5 years up to 15 years in the case of Transport for London. And so there are inevitably going to be leadership changes, significant number of leadership changes, and the acid test in terms of whether the model is really viable in the long run is, can you survive those transitions, and do you have enough support below the top level of management to help you bring the new management along, new leadership along?
It's certainly a challenge because we both know many very bright mid-level managers, technical staff that go in. Transit is a very attractive field. Many people want to work in transit because it does good things. It's not like working for a bank. I mean, it's actually helping people. So it's really, people are naturally attracted to it, but the bureaucracy and administrations and the fact that it's operations driven, and it's really, it's because it's labor intensive and operations driven, it's really hard to make it, to transform it into a data-driven decision-making environment. And people get frustrated and then they flee to consulting firms. Yes. So, keeping those people is, well, attracting them is difficult depending on the skill, but keeping them over time, training them and keeping them is really, really difficult.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think one of the things that we focus on at MIT, obviously we're educational as well as a research or institution. And so one of the points of entry to an agency that we'd like to develop a collaboration with is saying, we're producing people who will be very well trained, very knowledgeable about your specific organization after they complete a master's degree or whatever it is. And then the challenge, as you said, is the environment they're moving into in the industry sufficiently challenging and engaging to keep them there? And it doesn't always work. Obviously, a number of our graduates have started out in a public transit agency and moved into the private sector, and that's fine. It's good to get to that collaboration and that interchange. It enriches both, but there's certainly bureaucratic challenges that if you really want to get something done as a young graduate of any program, be it TAL or TU Delft or whatever, it's a challenge for many organizations to provide a sufficiently attractive environment in terms of progress and implementation of ideas that you keep them engaged as opposed to having them go into the private sector where they can potentially get things done and get a higher remuneration for it.
No, I hear you. That's a challenge. There are challenges for bureaucracy on the academic side too.
Yes.
You've experienced them firsthand. Doing applied research is a real challenge. The motivation system is difficult. I know lots of academics who would like to do that, but until they get tenure, and even then, they still are under pressure to get their promotions to publish in journals that.
Absolutely. I think the academic community has real challenges in doing applied research of the type with transit agencies that we're talking about at this conference. And being honest with you, I was able to sort of forget about what the expectations of MIT for me in terms of my career are after I got through tenure, which was 1978. And that was when I really shifted to away more from demand responsive to say, let me work on public transport because I think there's a better chance of getting these ideas implemented there. But it's a tremendous challenge. I mean, it's very exciting. As we saw from the poll, there are 37 academics involved sort of viewing this session already, as well as the same number of transit agency representatives. And from the academic side, I think if you look at the program, it's tremendously exciting to see the number and range of different universities and educational institutions that are very actively involved with the industry now. I think that's tremendous progress from the academic side, but there are still tremendous challenges for young faculty members at a place like MIT. You've got a short time to establish your scholarly credentials. This is best achieved either working with postdocs or with doctoral students, which will give you the depth of analytics and methodological research that you need to get good scholarly publications out of. And it really mitigates against applied research, which often, as in our case, involves heavily master students that can work on a project for 1 or 2 years and then move into the industry and be replaced by others. So I think there are tremendous challenges, and it's very exciting to me to see the number and range of universities that are involved in this type of collaborative research now with the industry.
No, absolutely. And there are very few universities that have had the ability through history or local culture or whatever to actually develop a team. In many cases, academics work, by themselves. If they're interested in transit, there's one person in the engineering department or in the planning department that's got a specific interest in transit, and that makes it even harder. But one of the things we're trying to look at is ways where they can, think about collaboration and sorts of interests that would make it more feasible for transit agents. Sorry, I'm getting dinged by you. I'm trying to turn it down, but on the side, there's lots of communications going on. Another topic that's a bit of I guess a frustration for me is the vendors and suppliers. You saw on the poll, almost none. In the project, the TCRP 113 with Peter, my job was to organize a workshop with suppliers to say, look, you really should start having modules to collect the data, because the data itself from the AVL systems is really useful. That was 2004. I mean, it took 10 years later before they even started doing that.
Yeah.
And they still show relatively little interest in doing this. It's starting to happen now in a bigger scale, but it's just, I find this quite surprising, and I don't know. I don't think you've had many interactions with suppliers, but I was just sort of curious on your take on that.
No, we've had discussions, but no serious relationships with the suppliers, and part of that is the conscious decision on our part. We want to be viewed as working with the transit industry for the transit industry, not working with suppliers that could raise conflict of interest questions. But I think, again, go back to the TfL model. I think the model that they followed, which is a very good one, is developing in-house expertise, so they're not so reliant on the supplier industry. The way they restructured their AFC system, the Oyster-based system, in the future ticketing project, as it was known during development, which led to the use of bank cards and mobile phones, in addition to Oyster card as fare media, was predicated on developing the in-house expertise to really understand what the hardware providers should be providing, and to really be in control of the data end of this. And I think that's it's a tough step for any operator, as almost all operators, who are challenged financially. How can you really justify doing that? But I think if you look at TfL's success, an important ingredient of that success was developing in-house expertise to be able to say, well, the hardware producers can do this, but we will take responsibility for doing much of the software development in-house, because we know exactly what we need and we know how to get that. It's a big lift for the agencies.
No, and we'll talk about that in Plenary 5 tomorrow. It's at least we're getting to the point. I mean, one of my frustrations that's sort of related to what I say is that, because transit agencies bought these systems not thinking about the data, they just basically signed away, suppliers would put in their boilerplate and they own the data. And it became a big shock when all the real-time apps came on about, 8-10 years ago. They didn't own the data, and they would have to pay license fees just to even use it to put into portals for the public. There was a TCRP legal digest on that that sort of showed the best practice in that area. At least I think by now, that is, I hope, standard practice, so that at least you've got the data, it's yours. Right. Getting staff, building that internal expertise, well, that is the next, that's where we're at now. And, the leaders are hiring, data scientists when they can, or business analysts at the very least, that have some knowledge of both the technologies and the data from the technologies and the applications. But that's an issue about where do you find these people, the data scientists and business analysts. Your program was specifically aimed at, forming people that do that. Mm-hmm. But most transit agencies have a tough time figuring out where they find these people.
Yes. And getting back to an earlier comment you made, we've been focused on a few leading agencies and having deep long-term relations, which enable us to work on research that's appropriate in an academic setting. And you've been looking at this gap between the leading agencies and the mass of the industry, not just in the US, but sort of worldwide. And I think that's a tremendous challenge. And the sorts of things that Alma was talking about that TAL would be doing in terms of trying to disseminate the results more broadly through training courses and other things. I think that's part of the solution, but it's, as you well know, it's very high. It's easy to recognize the problem, it's very hard to develop an effective solution for.
Yeah, no, I have this vision that, of 4 layers within the industry, with the top layer being the cutting edge, TfLs, MTRs, 3-5% of the total number of transit agencies. Yeah. The bottom layer being, those who will never have the resources to do anything, and there are areas that transit is just not important. It's just for the poor. You know, that's what's at 30% in the North America's context. The second layer is the best practice. They actually, you know, you go there and you can see that they're doing best practice. Well, what is that? 10, 15% of the total number of transit systems. So you've got 50% that are just following standard operating procedures. If you want to improve the industry, do you work with the top ones? Well, for academics, for their purpose and their objectives, they have to.
Right.
But I've always thought we really would improve the industry if we can get the 50% to move into the best practice. And that's part of the objective in the symposium, to try to get the word out and try to move in that direction.
Yeah, and again, I think you've done a tremendous job attracting so many industry participants to the conference. That's very important.
We have a question that was about data quality, quality assurance, cleaning up data. Do sort of a sense whether academics are more concerned about this or practitioners are. I think the comment that they thought academics were less concerned about it. I don't know. Do you have any? I mean, I know in developing the TFL and cleaning up to do the the OD matrices and so forth, you had to spend enormous amount of effort cleaning up data because the systems weren't designed to produce data in usable form. What's your thoughts about that?
So I mean, I think data quality is a big issue with many of these systems, and unless you have embedded within the organization a very strong capability for screening, resolving issues with data, and making sure the data has integrity and is actually representative of what's happening in the system, then this is going to be an overwhelming problem. I think if you look at the evolution of academic research in transit over the period of time that I've been involved in this, you've seen a very significant movement towards saying, if the data doesn't represent what's actually happening, i.e. has integrity, and we've screened out and either eliminated or corrected errors in the data, we won't get anything that's implementable. So if you have a program that its very existence is based on the agency you're working with that's funding the research being able to use the results of the research, that sort of enforces data integrity. And it's important both for the agency and the researchers. So I think, again, having this sort of research operating industry collaboration of different models, as we'll see tomorrow afternoon, is actually very important in terms of making sure that the data has integrity and we're doing good screening and correction for errors or elimination of errors. So I think it's absolutely.
And transit agencies, I think there are a couple presentations tomorrow morning and possibly Thursday morning, if I remember, on the data quality issue. I know for ages, I'd go to conferences and people were struggling with trying to get rid of negative counts at the end of loops, and where the bus laid over and stuff like this. And it's really hard. And the suppliers still, to my knowledge, do not provide diagnostics that help you figure out whether you've got problems in corrupt data or problems with your data. I mean, is it the sensors on board? Was it the download? Was it the matching to the schedules? Is it the layovers and, the matching the stops? So people have to spend an enormous amount of time. But I think, we're getting to the point that, I won't say most, but a lot of places have figured that out. And now we can get into the whole data management and sharing applications. And I'll make a plug for Plenary 6 because there's a project there, a new one that I'm on the panel, TCRP G18, that's really looking at how you share data and share applications so you just don't get PDFs and PowerPoints. And this was launched by John Levin of Metro Transit, and I've been supportive from the very get-go, and we've got this TCRP project going. And it's really trying to look at whether you can set up some sort of formal interfaces for structures so that people can start sharing data and applications much more easily. These are all still pretty big challenges. So, Willem, there are other questions out there. I think we're getting to the end.
Yeah, no questions have been posted other than that one yet.
Okay.
Oh, we just got a new one. Oh, if you want to take a read.
Okay, I'll try. Okay, maybe I'll just read it because it's too long. Okay, somebody, I guess from TFL, can vouch for the impact of the academic research program. Problem for us is more when the academics leave the building and continue the momentum to get all this hard work, fantastic insight into a full working productionized systems and making sure our stakeholders remain engaged. Start using the tools. That's the counterpart of what we were talking about with the CEOs being swapped out. I think the training part that you were able to do is a key to this, because the research is good and the applications are good, but in many cases, your students actually ended up in those agencies. Yeah. And then they bring that knowledge and that understanding of the interface between tools, technologies, data, and the business uses of them, and they're there. And so as long as you can try to keep them there, and you don't get discouraged and go off to consulting firms, you know. Speaking of consulting firms, the whole issue about making things better, it really relies a lot on them since they write the specifications for these systems. Now, we have a couple that are presenting that are on the cutting edge of this, but often you see a lot of cookie cutter approaches to specification writing. And I have a feeling that's been a bit of a hindrance in trying to get things to move forward and really use the data. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think, again, the solution comes back to building resources within the agency so that you can deal effectively with the consultants. You can specify exactly what you want from the consultants, knowing what your in-house expertise is and how it needs to be supplemented, rather than immediately saying, well, we have to rely on consultants for most of this. I think, again, consultants, as with technology suppliers, have a very important role, but it's up to the agency to think very carefully about how we define that role and we manage that role. And I think, again, some of the leading agencies like TFL do this very well.
I think, and I totally agree, the problem is, I mean, you can't get good results out of the consultants unless you've got good people managing the consultants, first of all. So again, it gets back to what you're saying, keeping people. Yeah. It's awfully hard for transit agencies. You know, operating staff are under the gun. They're going to be even more so with COVID-19 budget cuts. It gets back to whether the culture is really there or not. This remains a challenge. And one thing I think we haven't touched on is we need more, and I think we're hoping this conference will help a little bit with that, but we need more use cases that, you know, the people inside that are, you know, the revolutionaries trying to make things better can move it, show the bosses, that show the top management, show the boards, especially both the policy boards and the top management, that there's something useful and valuable that comes out of the analytics, out of the data, the use of the data. And it's not just data, of course, it's data transforms into information. So, you know, I like the expression DRIP, data rich, information poor. Lots of places are unfortunately like that. But I think we need to have more use cases. I'm starting to see it. I'm starting to see from vendors, from consultants, you know, I think we're slowly getting there, but we're gonna have to do a lot more because it's not inherently within the nature of policy board members and general management that are mostly fighting for funding and fighting the politics, both locally, state, federal, you know, they need to be convinced that and visualization is a really good tool. So hopefully that's going to move things in the right direction. I think you've spent a lot of time on visualization of some of the results.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I know we're wrapping up here, but I think if you look at where things were 20 years ago or more, as you said, progress has been frustratingly slow, but there's been a lot of progress made in that time. And again, I'd like to sort of recognize TCRP as a major force in trying to get over this gap between research ideas and sort of innovation and broad adoption. I think TCRP has done a pretty good job overall in focusing on this and saying it's not just enough to do interesting research. We need to have synthesis documents. We need to really get out there and have good use cases, as you say. So I think there are a number of promising signs that things are moving in the right direction. They're never moving as rapidly as we would like, but still we're moving in the right direction. I think the program here is really highlighting the progress that has been made of late, which is great.
I'll add not just TCRP, but since I'm with my Division A technical activities hat, I'll say the TRB committees themselves have played a very useful role for the transit agencies that have the ability to participate in TRB. But I agree, I'm much more optimistic. I'm happy with the way the symposium is shaping up. I think the curve has been, flat, very slow, and we're now really dipping. It's really neat to see, some of the transit agencies sending 4 or 5 people to the symposium to really to come to Toronto virtually to experience all this. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Nigel. It's been wonderful having this conversation. I think there's some housekeeping things, so I didn't mention, but we know that this is hard, virtual conferences, so we tried to build in almost everywhere 20-minute breaks. Sometimes we had to squeeze them a little bit, but have substantial breaks. The next set of sessions start in 20 minutes, and there are 3 parallel rooms. You go back to the main hub in the Union website. From there, you can click on which session, and that'll should take you right into the room. If you want to, there are 3 parallel sessions. If you want to change rooms, you leave the room, you go back to Union, and then click on the other room. And I think Amer wants to make a mention about tweeting. Maybe Amer, if you're online, maybe you can say specifically rather than me try to figure out my phone and what you said.
Yeah, so please tweet as much as you can. Use, please mention us, at Transit Data 2020, and also use the hashtag Transit Data 2020 as much as you can. Thank you.
And remember the cool things beyond the program: lunch today, pre-show tomorrow, lunch speaker tomorrow, pre-show Thursday, and lunch show on Thursday. So full program. Thank you all for participating. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Sure. Thank you.